Good afternoon and good evening, and perhaps even good morning. I'm so happy to welcome you all here today for our program, Poetics of Art and Intervention. I'm Mary Miller, Director of the GRI, that is to say, the Getty Research Institute, one of 4 programs on the Getty Center campus: Museum, Conservation Institute, Foundation, and Research Institute. That's us. Here in Southern California on November 17th, it's just 5 p.m. We, the Getty Research Institute, acknowledge our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples. You, our audience, are in many time zones and countries, from India, Peru, Mexico, Australia, Korea, and all over Europe and North America and more. And a warm greeting to all of you who may be watching this program asynchronously in replay. I welcome you all. We're taping this program and we'll post it on YouTube within a week or so. And we're grateful to all of you for your engagement and to our enthusiastic panel today. I'll turn this panel over to LeRonn Brooks and the participants in just a minute, but let me say a bit more about what will transpire today. Our panel will explore the role of artists as cultural curators and as arbiters of cultural capital, and how visual art, poetry, criticism, and other forms of cultural production have the power to confront the ideological and political systems that have seemingly defined communities, national borders, and social values, and yet are still rooted very deeply in systems of bias, injustice, and race. How are contemporary writers, artists, and thinkers reimagining the relationship between the idea of canons and belonging and the reality of historical exclusion? In this conversation today, Getty curator LeRonn Brooks brings together Claudia Rankine, Monica Youn, and Jess Row to discuss how their creative practices engage with the poetics of art and intervention. LeRonn Brooks is the host of our conversation today. He is Associate Curator for Modern and Contemporary Collections at the Getty Research Institute and a specialist in African American art. He has recently published in Bomb Magazine, Callaloo, and International Review of African American Art, and on behalf of such organizations as the Studio Museum, Spelman College Museum, and Aperture Foundation. Claudia Rankine is poet, essayist, and playwright, the editor of several anthologies, and the founder of the Racial Imaginary Institute, about which we will hear today. She is also a MacArthur Fellow. Professor Rankine teaches at New York University as a professor of creative writing. Monica Youn is the author of Blackacre, Ignatz, and Barter, and the forthcoming From. A finalist for the National Book Award, she held a Guggenheim Fellowship in 2018. The daughter of Korean immigrants and a former constitutional lawyer, she is professor at UC Irvine. Jess Row is a novelist and essayist. His most recent book is White Flights, Race, Fiction, and the American Imagination. He's also the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, and Granta Magazine named him the best young American novelist a few years ago. He directs the undergraduate creative writing program in the Department of English at NYU. I'm eager to hear our colleagues and to find out what they have to say about the poetics of art, imagination, and intervention, and then to explore the questions beyond the initial panel conversation. At any point, you, our audience, can begin adding questions to the Q&A. And now, over to LeRonn.
Thank you, Mary. And good to see everyone. Good to see you, Claudia. Good to see you, Monica. Good to see you, Jess. I'd like to begin this conversation with a meditation on the idea of the racial imaginary and what exactly is meant by the racial imaginary at the intersection of art, right? And this idea of intervention. So I'm going to read a little bit from Claudia's book, the racial imaginary writers on race and the life of the mind. And this is with Beth Lofrida. The racial imaginary found its start in a few intuitions. We are all, no matter how little we like it, the bearers of unwanted and often shunned memory, of a history whose infiltrations are at times so stealthy, we can pretend otherwise, and at times so loud we can't hear much of anything else. We're still there differently than those before us, but there, otherwise known as here. And that matters for writers. And for me, this idea of here is more profound than, it's sort of a profound gesture that we can sort of meditate on. And the fact that it matters to writers in that particular degree, I mean, artists in general, is the way to sort of begin this conversation on what the racial imaginary is. So Monica, you want to turn on your camera? Claudia, Jess?
Hi, LeRonn. Hi, Jess. Hi, Monica.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, my
Hey,
6-year-old is in the background, just longing to Zoom bomb this, so lurking.
So I also want to begin with this question. Now, Claudia, this book, The Racial Imaginary Text, is 2016, right? And this is for everybody. What in the world was happening in 2016? What in the world was happening?
In 2000, why, you mean why then?
Why then?
Well, I think it could have been at any time, but during those years, I was thinking a lot about the ways in which whiteness went unaddressed in American culture, and everything that happened without an aggressor. So, you know, this is actually a quote by Teju Cole, but there was racism without racists, sexism without the patriarchy. And so the idea was to ask people who are writers, who are engaged in culture making, to think about what that omission was and what it meant to them. And Beth Lofrida and I spent a lot of time trying to theorize what those omissions were. And so that's how the book came into being.
Mm-hmm. And in the credo of the Racial Imaginary Institute, can we describe what the Racial Imaginary Institute is? Well, an interdisciplinary gathering of artists to sort of address this moment, right? And so the interdisciplinarity of the group, the idea that we're coming together to address what was going on in that particular moment, the rise of white supremacy, the rise of hate crimes at that particular moment, left a real kind of chill in the air. And when you say here in that introduction, we're still here, right? We're still here in this historical moment that sort of rolls over to every generation. We're the bearers of this. And so as a way to respond to that particular moment, when did you think about coming up with a group of creators, a group of artists to sort of address this moment? So not as an individual, but a gathering of people. When did that idea?
Well, I thought it's not something that one person can do. This is, there were many people engaged with the idea in different corners, thinking about it and doing something. And I thought it would be productive to create an umbrella organization where we could all come together in community, talk about these issues, and invite institutions to join us in thinking and showing and discussing these issues.
Mm-hmm. And so the On Whiteness exhibition, the symposium, and the performance series is a sort of outgrowth of the Racial Imaginary Institute and the work that we've all done together. Monica, what was that moment like for you, just in terms of being in the group and the kinds of work you thought you can do with a collective like the Racial Imaginary?
Well, I thought it it was interesting, and I was just reflecting on your previous question about 2016, and of course there are so many things that were the same about that moment. There was such continuity, but there was also some sort of difference. And when I think about how to articulate that difference, I mean, it wasn't just 2016, but you could feel something growing in the years before that. And I always think of it like in the Terminator, where, you know, the Skynet or whatever, like it's always been there. It's always been powerful, but it gained consciousness. And I felt like whiteness took on a certain consciousness of itself that it hadn't been as conscious of itself as a tribal entity before that. And with that consciousness came power. Or maybe it was just able to speak that consciousness more openly than it had before.
Mhm.
And that gets into the question of interdisciplinary. I mean, interdisciplinarianity, which is a difficult word to say, but I think that we are workers in the imaginary, and there are a lot of workers in the imaginary. Activists are workers in the imaginary. Scholars, philosophers, lawyers to a certain extent are workers in the imaginary. And could we counter this, their imaginary with our imaginaries? And you know, that how could we see that work done? And that's what I was thinking about when Claudia asked me to join the group.
So in the in our bio as a group, one of the paragraphs goes, we begin here in order to make visible that which has been intentionally presented as inevitable, so that we can move forward into more revelatory conversations about race. And so On Whiteness was our first project, but this idea of making what was going on in the world visible, or making statements as artists, as curators, as creatives, to actually make the challenge to the rise in white supremacy, the challenge to the atmosphere. For me, it was Emmanuel AME, 2015, right? That I began to really think about what was rolling at that particular moment. And so as a group, as a curatorial collective, it's really important, you know, for us to actually flesh that out, to challenge it, to make art exhibitions and things like that. So it's for Jess, in 2016, in terms of your understanding what was going on in the moment and your concerns, right? What was happening in terms of your creative life, your writing, and your lecturing at that particular moment?
So, you know, I would say that, you know, with the benefit of hindsight that we now have, there was a state of, I'm sorry, there's a little construction noise in the background. There was, you know, Obama's election in 2008, and then the events that sort of spawned the Black Lives Matter movement in the, excuse me, in the early 2010s, inaugurated what I think was a sense of a racial emergency. And I think that it really, the temperature really rose in August of 2014 with the events in Ferguson, the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson. And what changed, I think, what was so dramatic about that moment was that the sense of that racial emergency didn't go away. Race entered the headlines and didn't leave the headlines, and in some ways still hasn't left the headlines, you know, 7 years later. So for me, I had begun writing a novel about a kind of speculative novel, almost a science fiction novel, about something called racial reassignment surgery, which was the idea that people could undergo a full body surgery that totally transformed their racial being. That's not a new idea, but I sort of added a new technological spin to it in my novel, Your Face and Mine, which came out the month of Ferguson. It came out in August of 2014. And so I found myself thrust into a very different conversation, a very different social state. When I began writing that novel in 2010, 2011, it was it really felt like a climate of racial silence. And I was told not to write the novel. I was told nobody would want to read it. I was told it was too risky, et cetera, et cetera. And then when it was finally published in August of 2014, it was sort of just the opposite. And for me, you know, from those early years in which I was writing Your Face and Mine and dealing with the question of whiteness, trying to deal with the question of whiteness directly, it came to be more and more central to my thinking to bring whiteness forward and to consider it as a phenomenon. And so that's what led directly from the publication of my novel to writing the essays that made up my book, White Flights, which came out in 2019. I mean, it was the sense of a national racial emergency, which was both a sort of emergency of thought and a crisis of the imagination, and of course, a very real emergency of racial terrorism that that intensified. It didn't start in the early 2010s, but it intensified, and then it became the national junta, or whatever you want to call it, in November of 2016.
I remember.
Oh, go ahead, Monica. I'm sorry.
I remember, you know, my book of poems came out in September of 2016, and I had a poem in there that was thinking about the subjunctive. I mean, it sounds a little technical, but I was thinking about the subjunctive in English with respect to race, and the way in which you are becomes as if you were. Like the way in which we talk about fantasy or unreality likes to mask itself as the past tense, and the way our racial imaginings like to cloak themselves in trappings of pastness, of like nostalgia, like the value added in Make America Great Again. And so I remember the day after the election, I was on book tour and I was reading that poem and just broke down and couldn't continue. Just thinking about like all of this nostalgia, like look at where we are.
You know, in thinking about it, I was thinking that it was really 2005 for me with Hurricane Katrina, that the idea that under the Bush administration that populations of people, poor Black and white people, were abandoned by the government, and there was a sort of blatant disregard for these people, and many of them African Americans. That to me was the moment when I felt it was necessary to stay the course on the trajectory of the abandonment that was happening. It obviously had been happening, but at that level, that publicly, there was something that shifted for me in 2005, which then went on to determine a kind of new poetics in terms of my own work.
You're making me think. So I was teaching Africana studies, and I was trying to, and everything that you're saying sounds like my syllabus that I was teaching, but because the momentum of it, right? 2005, the momentum of these things, of these moments of failure, right? Of these moments of, the moments where racism is realized institutionally, politically, right? And the ways that it affected Black and brown people, the momentum of that was yeah, I mean, Claudia, going way back. And so this idea of how do we respond to it, right? For me, I was trying to arm my students on a world that they felt was becoming more threatening to them, right? And so everything that I was teaching was aimed toward how do I prepare them to deal with the world that we all was sensing was changing to a certain degree in terms of, the rise in hate crimes, the rise in a sort of animus, a bad animus toward Black and brown people. And so, just thinking about what everyone is saying, I think On Whiteness, the exhibition, was a way for us to sort of to challenge this momentum, right? To sort of reframe it and put it in front of people visually, and put these challenges, these questions that we have visually into the world, and let there be a discussion, So what I want to do right now, I want to go to the slideshow, and so we can sort of just rewind for a minute in terms of On Whiteness. Can we begin the slideshow, please? Next slide, please. And so on Whiteness, the exhibition, we collaborate with the kitchen, and to curate this sort of multi-part experience, right? So here we see the list of the participating artists. And for me, inviting these artists to be a part of the show was a way to sort of reach out and build community, but everyone on this list was sort of feeling it anyway, right? Don't you think so? And so what we were doing was actually helping to give a larger voice, right? Just in terms of the artist community, writers, in terms of the symposium, academics, and here visual artists. And so Cindy Sherman, we see Titus Kafar, we see Basira Khan, we see, so many names here. And together it was a way for us, I think, to combine forces in a way. Right? And so here we see the performance residencies, performances, the Dark Noise Collective, Vijay Iyer, Jackie Siblings, Jury, Angie Pittman. So all of this momentum, all of this energy, how can we find creative ways to respond? Give the next slide, please. The symposium, Nell Painter. So even how can we sort of theorize it? How we begin to examine it and theorize it? So the symposium played an important part to sort of unraveling and challenging this idea of whiteness. Next slide, please. And participating institutions. So everyone we've seen here, every name, every institution, wanted to raise a challenge to the question of where are we? So back to the introduction, Claudia, the question of here, we're still here. What does that mean, right? And so can we move forward to the next slide? And these are installation shots from the exhibition. The next slide, please. You can just keep them moving, right? Glenn Ligon.
Ken Gonzalez Day.
Ken Gonzalez Day. Thank you, Ken, if you're watching.
And I remember being there a couple of days before the exhibition with LeRonn and Claudia, just kind of intervening in the hanging of the space, saying this is not aggressive enough. Like we really want the gun in the eye of Melchin's sculpture to be pointing directly at the viewer when it comes in, which was not how it was originally arranged. We wanted Basira Khan's ceiling to be uncomfortably low so that people would feel as if they're having to go through this kind of tunnel in order to arrive at the space. We wanted the chandelier in that space, which was site specific, to be almost hitting you in the head as you walked in. We wanted to curate discomfort, to sort of push back against this habituated whiteness.
Absolutely. Next slide, please.
And systemic discomfort that many
discomfort
have to manage on a day-to-day course.
Yeah. And that Paul Chan piece, I remember those fans were very noisy, and we wanted it in that small a space so that if you walked into it, you felt like these things were going to touch you, like they were going to push up against you and you didn't want them to.
And you really couldn't determine where they would go, right? So you walk into, and so they looked like Klansmen. You walk into that small room. It's sort of a direct confrontation of soft objects, but the metaphor remains. It's the confrontation and the unpredictability of the ways in which white supremacy will travel or affect people institutionally or through the judicial system. Next slide, please. And here's part of the performance series. This is Vijay Iyer, his player piano. Next slide, please. Here's the library we had outside as a way to sort of prep people or to give people a larger understanding of what we were reading at the time. Next slide, please. And here are images from the exhibition itself. And it was a really large crowd because there was a need for this particular discussion, especially at that time. Next slide, please.
And Charlotte Lagarde's work was about the library.
Next slide, please. Next slide, please. That's it. Okay, could you stop slideshow, please? Right. So within that context, what did you feel that exhibition accomplished, or possibly didn't, Claudia, or Jess, if you were there at the time? Yeah.
Well, one thing that I was pleased about is that it was able to bring together all the artists who themselves were already engaged in the activity of creating interventions into how we see American history. And to have them all in one place, it made it a continuous discussion, a continuous way of seeing that was immersive. And because, you know, obviously we had seen Melchin here and Titus there, but to have them brought in such close proximity, the conversation could sort of butt up against each other.
And I was happy. I remember the folks at the kitchen commenting on the crowd, and they're saying not only is this crowd like enormous with a line around the block, but these are not the usual suspects. These are not the people who we always see at exhibitions. There are a lot of newbies who don't seem to be very engaged in art. There are a lot of people who were just curious and who came. And I was happy to see them in this space. I was happy that the symposium and the performance residencies were also able to be in the same space, so that, you know, during the breaks in the symposium, the, you know, philosophers and historians and law professors would come and, you know, and look at the space, confront the space, talk to each other about it.
Yeah. And Jess, that intersection between you being a novelist or writing and visual art, what do you think is the sort of the power of bringing them together? Or is there a power in bringing them together? The title of this is Art and Intervention, but I don't know that intervention is the right word here. Do they come together to intervene? Did we come together to intervene, or is it something more powerful in terms of how to place that? What do you think, Jess?
It's, you know, it's a great question. I mean, the thing that I think is so valuable about bringing together different artists from different art forms and different art communities in the same space begins with the fact that artists don't normally do that. And so, and, you know, our artistic communities tend to be relatively siloed from one another. You know, the grant structure is different, how people make a living is different, you know, everything about it, you know, the sort of the vocabulary is different, the points of reference are different. And you know, what happens when you bring different arts together is that you see parallels, but you also see realms of the imagination that maybe your art form doesn't normally touch on, you know. So that, you know, for writers to interact with visual artists is to think about all different ways of imagining space, and, you know, imagining the visual, imagining the sensory, imagining you know, sonic landscapes, which is something, you know, we're writers, we deal with that more in the abstract. So to see it materialized can change your whole sense of what you're doing with a writing project, and vice versa. When visual artists, artists in nonverbal media, or mostly nonverbal media, come together with writers, you know, they tend to write, and they create new kinds of you know, interventions in the literary space. And, you know, to think about that as a way of dealing with questions of the racial imaginary is just a way of opening up all of the different dimensions of the racial imaginary, because it really, you know, it does, the racial imaginary happens within all of the senses and happens all of the time. So it's, you know, so to think of it in terms of the way you occupy physical space, or the way that you do performance, the way that you think about music, you know, it gives you a kind of a 360 view that you can't get otherwise. You know, that's what's so important, and also, you know, and also challenging about the work that the racial imaginary does, because we're talking about different communities, different points of reference, as I was saying before, and groups of people that don't normally, you know, play together So
Right.
it's a, it's a, so that, that's a kind of that's the special challenge, and it produces really unique and important results.
Yeah. You make me think about form. It's a question of form, right? Because you bring in the sensory as a part of the experience that's important to have, right? But you make me think about the question of form, having all of these events at the kitchen, right? The symposium, the residencies, and the physical exhibition made that space a way, or I would say campus, but made that space a sort of an interlocutor in terms of how we view all of these different forms of art coming together, right? At one particular place. And so in terms of the ways in which you as writers use form, I know Claudia and Citizen, you challenge form. Monica, you challenge form all the time in your writing. And Jess, you challenge form all the time in your writing. How do you think the question of form, right? Because, part of this is, maybe we can talk about the canon or these separate canons, the canon of visual art, the canons of poetry, the canons of fiction and nonfiction, but to actually say that there's a multidisciplinary stance that goes in all of those directions, but comes from a place that wants one change, and that's the end of white supremacy, right? And so we think about form. How do you think form informs the ways in which you tackle this issue? How important is it to you, the challenging of it? Claudia, you want to?
Well, I think, form is everything. I want to use this opportunity actually to bring forward Tim Gifford at the kitchen, because I think his flexibility in terms of understanding the pursuit of the reframing of how power works in the United States as a question that belonged in an art institution. And he was willing to allow us to bring in a sort of academic symposium alongside a art exhibition. So I think, so that's physical form adapting itself to a question that was larger than all of us.
Mm.
In terms of my own work, I feel that the form and the content should always be in conversation with each other. And so if I'm using white space in my work, I'm using it because I'm interested in what white space is, what it does, how it consumes, what it takes over. But also there's the flip side of silence. What is silence doing to us in terms of addressing these questions? So the formal decisions are never separate from the written language line of inquiry. Mm-hmm. The two of them are always working in tandem.
Mm-hmm. You make me think there's no silence or invisibility, even when there's on the page. Exactly. Everything is accountable. Mm-hmm. Every part of it. Monica?
Yeah, well, I wanted to agree with Claudia and her shout out to the kitchen, who were the best, most generous, and most
Lumi
challenging.
And Tim, thank you if you're watching.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And also, to think about some of our other partners, like in particular, I wanted to mention BAM and the work that they did in film, where they would take very well-known films, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, Taxi Driver, and say, okay, well, let's think about these films as instantiating and reifying whiteness, right? What happens if we make whiteness salient in those films and re-examine what surrounds us, which kind of brings me to this question of form. Form is, I agree with Claudia, it's always, if idea is the thought, then form is the body, right? And you can't take the two of them apart. But part of this idea of habituated whiteness is, how do you make yourself uncomfortable in your body? How do you do that even in the artwork you're making? And so I've been more and more exploring, I guess, what you would call tonal power. I think of form as a subset of tone. Tonal discomfort, like what does it mean if I take on the voice of the white authority figure? What if I take on the voice of power, the voice of law in writing that? What if I take on the the tone policing that has been mandated, or the sort of, legal training that was kind of driven into me, and make that visible, make that salient, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a powerful statement, to think that, Ferris Bueller's Day Off can be an instrument of, white privilege, just in terms of the invisibility of it, right? So, there's no blankness, for Claudia, the blank on the page is not blank, the whiteness is indicted, right? So to think about visually, you mentioned Ferris Bueller's Day Off, the ways in which white privilege is all through that. But as a young Black kid in Queens, I just saw that as normalcy, right? Even though I did not share the privileges that I was seeing, right? Yeah, so consciousness around form, or consciousness, bring a new consciousness toward an accepted or normalized object that exudes white supremacy, is also part of the project. Yeah,
You
thank
know,
you. Yep.
I loved what Monica said about the body and the intellect, because one of the ways in which whiteness has functioned, white supremacy has functioned, is to give the body to people of color and to hold on to the intellect as superior, transcendent, and above the needs and the feelings of the body. And when one begins to actually look at it, you understand that this system was put in place to privilege the white body, in fact. And then a lot of work was done to separate the two in terms of how we think about what whiteness is doing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yep. Jess?
This conversation reminds me of an incident that Jeff Chang talks about in his book, Who We Be. There was some kind of a panel, or maybe a discussion sort of like this one. I think it was at MoMA in the 1970s with Ad Reinhardt, the painter, and Cecil Taylor, the very famous jazz pianist and composer. And they had a public argument about the meaning of Blackness, about the meaning of the color Black, where Ad Reinhardt was saying that his use of Black in his paintings, which were largely monochromatic, his use of Black was unrelated to any, it was non-referential. Of course, it was abstract, it was non-referential. And Cecil Taylor said, that's actually not possible. It's actually, it's not possible. He was speaking of his own of his own art practice. He said, that is simply not possible for me. It would, as another human being, to look at the color Black and say that it is non-referential and non-specific, and that it is open to formal manipulation by anybody in exactly the same way, which is what Ad Reinhardt believed. So it's that kind of basic clash around the question of form that I think the Racial Imaginary Institute steps right into. Because we have, the artists and the writers and the people we have collaborating with us are operating at a very, very high formal level, but insisting that you look at the implications of that you look at the content implications, as Claudia was just saying.
Absolutely. And the consequence, think about the consequence, right?
Right, exactly.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And the physical consequence.
Mm-hmm.
If you think about comorbidities, where did that come from?
Absolutely.
Yeah. For those in the audience, you can begin actually putting questions in the Q&A if you have them in the time we have left. I was thinking about that as well, Claudia, this idea of what we're doing has a level of accountability to it because it's actually in the world. This isn't abstract, or this isn't taking off into the notion of non-figurative abstraction like Anne Reinhardt, for artists, there's a way for a lot of Black artists or a lot of people, there's always a cultural connotation to even a color. And there's a cultural connotation with a political and real world bodily a consequence for people of color when we think about the ways in which we're sort of in the world. And so working with the white imaginary, going in there, it's a tricky territory. right? Claudia, when you spoke at the symposium, I think you made a point to actually say that we're doing this not just for this moment. I'm going back to this question of here, right? We're doing this not for this moment, just for this moment, but the question of what will the future, right? And so in terms of the kind of work that we want to see done and the kind of work that we're doing as a collective and the kind of here that is tomorrow, right? The kind of here we want tomorrow to be. How do we do that as a collective? How do we do that? It's a profound, this is a heck of a question to ask in the time we have, but.
Well, one of the things that's been heartening to me, I don't know if you can see, but I have here the new 1619 Project book that Nicole Hannah-Jones and the New York Times put out. And this book is yet another form of a corrective to the proliferation of misinformation around American history. So we're beginning to see people step in not without consequence. And it was under a lot of fire, a lot of attack for this project. So I think more and more we understand that the intervention has to happen, the reframing has to happen. And Ava DuVernay, her work, you look around, you're beginning to see people do the work of reframing, of stepping in, of saying, actually, it wasn't that. Kathy Park Hong, Monica Youn, Jess Row, everybody is now taking it as a personal responsibility. And that, to me, is our only way forward.
Yeah. And I think that the fact that there is that we are now seeing this backlash, backlash means that a blow was struck on our part to which they are reacting. And I remember I grew up as a kid in the Texas public school system being taught that the Civil War was not about slavery, had nothing to do with slavery, it was only about states' rights. And was taught this as truth. And the fact that at least now students and parents in these schools know that there is such a thing called critical race theory that some people are learning, and that there are, other things that happened in history that people might mention, even if they are upset about it, is for me a plus. I was taught Gone with the Wind as a work of literature in my senior year of high school. They aren't doing that anymore.
Right. Jess?
I think that we're in a really profound moment right now because the backlash is so intense, and white supremacist rhetoric and violence and
policy.
Policy and the symbolic order of white supremacy has become the position of one of the two political parties in the United States, and so there's a really is a sense in which that we live in a very worrisome time, and it's and I think of course there's also this sense in which in the kind of the blue side of the country, there's also this major backlash going on in terms of the anti-woke politics of the supposedly centrist figures who are now coalescing around people like Barry Weiss and John McWhorter and Jonathan Haidt, and so this is a very polarized and a very difficult time, and I think it's a time for those of us who started bringing together these groups and doing this work in earnest in the last decade to really kind of stiffen our spines and I hate to use violent metaphors, but kind of gird ourselves for to defend these practices and ways of thinking, because we've reached this moment where, as Monica is saying, the interventions and the work of people like Nicole Hannah-Jones, the work of the defund the police movement, the abolition movement, the anti-mass incarceration movement, have scored real victories. And when you get real victories, you get the opposite, the equal and opposite, and more than opposite reaction. And that's the phase we're in. We're in now. And so in some sense, our work is more important than ever.
Yeah. You make me think that the here that it was yesterday, the here that is today, and the here that will be, tomorrow. Monica, when you were, a couple of questions ago, your comment made me think about the question of narration and the narrator, right? In terms of our projects, we introduce a different kind of narrator, a different kind of voice to the narrator. And Jess, you were talking about your book and the idea of the narrator in that book, the changing of the body and what have you. In terms of challenging canons, right? Now, as an independent group not attached to an institution, there's a lot of leeway in terms of how we think about challenging the canon or how we operate. But this idea of artists taking on the voice of the narrator and playing with that as a way to sort of challenge the disciplinary restrictions or the myopic view of the people who began what we consider to be our individual canons. And so how important is it as artists for us to actually take possession of the voice of the narrator?
I think it's incredibly important. I mean, I worked as a lawyer and as a constitutional lawyer and as a registered lobbyist, and now I'm a poet. And there are people who would like you to think that those occupations have very little to do with each other, whereas they're the same occupation. I mean, Citizens United is about three metaphors: that money is speech, that corporations are people, and that elections are a marketplace. Now, the difference between their metaphors and our metaphors, their stories and our stories, is that they're the ones with the monopoly on violence, right? They're the ones with the police behind them, and we're not. But the only way to push back with stories is with better stories, right?
Absolutely. Claudia?
Well, I think, in 1933, Berlin, we understood why the Nazis felt like they had to burn books and ban and burn books, because ideas are powerful. And culture is what takes hold of a person's mind in terms of opening it out to what is possible, which is why, somebody in the question and answer asked what our next project was. And, I think it's important for us at a time when voter suppression is at a height to begin to think about what a national we is. Who are we? What do we stand for? The word we itself. And so I think we have to begin to understand ourselves all as Americans, but also Americans with different things at stake. And so the Racial Imaginary right now is working on a symposium and cultural shows that address this notion of the fragility of we.
Yeah, because it is a fragile we, this idea of a collective identity that we can sort of assume to have and then operate in the world. You make me think that, culture is like water to a fish. You just swim in it and you don't know that you're breathing it until there's an effect that makes it obvious. It could be an art exhibition, a book. It could be other kinds of acts that make you aware that you've been swimming in assumptions about who you are based upon dominant narratives your entire life. And so the question of who gets to, make that water, right? Who gets to actually form the ideas by which we assume identities is really important, because if you think of Black and brown people, historically, you think about the Harlem Renaissance, you think about the Black Power movement, you think about all the different kinds of movements that created more forceful identities to bring a sort of not just the body, but the mind, right, Claudia? The mind of Black and brown people into the fore, and not just, so just thinking, about that, so we have a question here, another question. Do you worry that the counteraction, reaction will overpower your efforts, and how do you think strategically to counteract that?
If I can just say, one thing that we've been having a conversation about in the Racial Imaginary Institute is about developing the next generation and working with younger artists of all fields to help them sort of develop their work so that we can, establish a longer legacy. Essentially, I think that's that's really an open question. I mean, if you think about, for example, if you think about the Black Arts Movement and the heyday of the Black Arts Movement in the 1970s, the heyday was not that long, but it had a very long tail. It positioned Toni Morrison, for example, in a position of great cultural power as an editor at Random House. And she used that to elevate people like Gail Jones and Toni Cade Bambara, and these people whose influence and whose work lasted into the 80s and 90s in a time of immense, retrogression, and a sort of new kind of racism. You had these very powerful figures who were, doing their best work under these conditions of immense cultural pressure. And so I think that's part of what we have to think about now.
Mm-hmm.
And I think also part of it is institutions. Like, all of us are affiliated with prestigious institutions, so that we are not ourselves that, we have the privilege of not feeling fear most of the time. But, when you think about the Black Arts Movement, but then you think about and all of this the mentoring that happened, but then you also think about Gwendolyn Brooks taking her power and saying, I'm going to publish with Black-owned presses from now on. Like, I'm going to create my own institutions. I'm going to nurture our own institutions. And I think that the fact of the racial imaginary being a different institution, not being owned by one of these institutions that we are, that pay our salaries, but being something separate from that and not housed at any one of these institutions, gives us an independence. And we see all of these institutions, in the poetry world. We have Cave Canem, we have Kundiman, we have the Asian American Writers Workshop in Canto Mundo, and all these wonderful things, which you see, we need to create our own spaces.
Absolutely.
But also, I think we also have to make the work. When I think about a book like Minor Feelings by Kathy Park Hong, for example, the Asian American women in my classes are over the moon to have in their hands something that reflects their own lives and concerns. And that will then propel them into the making of work that continues that and opens out the experience of what it means to be an Asian woman in this culture in ways that we haven't seen up until now.
This week we have the first Asian Muppet on Sesame Street after 50 years.
Yeah, so there you go.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So what do you think? So we work with institutions, but I mean, to your point, the collective is also an institution, right? And so there's a way in which people who produce culture can work with institutions that necessarily don't produce culture, but use cultural artifacts to create a culture, right? And that culture is influenced by the institutional thinking. And so in terms of being artists who formed a sort of institution to work with institutions that have histories of, maybe histories of institutional bias and what have you, I mean, that is something. So, does anyone want to speak, and tell me if left, does anyone want to speak around the idea of collaboration, artists collaborating with institutions to not only maybe challenge the cultural biases of those institutions, but using those resources in that collaboration to actually make a larger change? So the nature of our collaboration, do you want to speak to that?
Well, one of the things, Monica mentioned Gwendolyn Brooks pulling her books from major publishing houses. Many of those books ultimately went out of print. That's the other half of the story. And so it seems to me to make sense to work within institutions where the ideas can continue to circulate within the society and shift the institutions that already have the power to move into the future. You know, so I feel like it's important for us to recognize individual efforts of grassroots presses, et cetera, but also to understand that the institutions that have the money and the history behind them that will propel them in the future can also change. Those institutions are made up of people, and people can change. So the institution can change, and to work within the institution is to force the change.
Monica? Thank you, Claudia.
Oh yeah, no, definitely. Both are important, which is why I was so pleased at our sort of, that our efforts to invite institutions to enter into our conversation and to look, and particularly in the Whiteness show, to look at their own practices, to examine their own collections, and to make things visible that maybe they had gotten a little too used to. Where, you know, maybe it was, you know, one of the most satisfying parts of our work, I think.
Yeah. And it's also the world. I mean, the world I mean, the world happens, and the world was happening at that particular moment. You had protests, you had all kinds of social pressures in which institutions had to reply, if only to be relevant to what society was, what was happening in the world. And so yeah, I mean, Jess, do you want to?
You know, this just puts me in mind of one of the, unfortunately, the great lost opportunities of the pandemic. Claudia had a play about white men, of a musical of a kind, I guess, you know, a truly thrilling work, which was opening in the middle of March 2020. And unfortunately, there were some preview performances. I was very lucky to get to see one, but it didn't actually, unfortunately, it did not actually open, and hopefully it will at some point. But it was staged at the Shed, which is, for those of you who don't know it, it's this enormous new art space that was created in the big Hudson Yards development in New York. So, you know, if you just look at that space and you think about all of the power and machinations and real estate millions and tens of millions that went into creating that whole sort of complex, and then to see a work as disturbing and revolutionary as what Claudia was doing in that play, you know, as one of the first works in that space. That's, you know, that's the kind of thing that the Racial Imaginary Institute is sort of interested in, is walking right into the corridors of power, and doing the work, you know, not in some artistic remove, but right in the center of the sometimes very troubling spaces of cultural, financial, political power.
Exactly.
The play will open this coming March in 2022. So, but you know, they have to let us in. That's the other. We can't just walk in. So the tricky part of it is having the institutions invite us in, which shows an openness to the possibility of looking at things in a different way.
Absolutely. And another question is of who we empower, right? So it's not just working with these major institutions, but who do we as a group empower and use some of those resources to bring their voices to the fore, right? In terms of how we see the kinds of participation that can make substantive change, you know? So in the time we have to wrap up in a few. And so in the time we have, where do we go from here, Claudia? Where do we go from here?
Well, we are going towards a deep conversation around nationalism. We are heading into a crucial election in a few years. We're looking at voter suppression like you haven't seen it in recent time. And women's rights are, you know, there goes Texas, and where else we'll go, we don't know yet. So I think we are in a very important historical moment right now. And the racial imaginary is the work that we are doing, I think, at least will bring the issues to the fore so that we can discuss them, think about them, understand what they are and what the ramifications are for us as individuals, as communities, as Americans.
To do what artists do. Yeah.
To do what artists do, to change the culture, to make the culture.
Thank you. Yeah. Monica?
I mean, I don't think I can say any better than that. I mean, and we will keep listening and we will keep learning.
Yeah, absolutely. Jess?
I just want to say, LeRonn, thank you for this opportunity, and thank you to the Getty for hosting this conversation. And you know, it's always great to have new partners as we move our work forward.
Yes, thank you. So I guess in closing out, I want to say thank you, Claudia. Thank you, Monica. Thank you, Jess, for this great conversation and participating today. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. And let's do the work.
Good night.
Good night. Good night.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Good to see you.